The 7th Democratic debate in Iowa was hosted by CNN and the Des Moines Register, and featured Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer. The event was the final debate before the Iowa Caucus, and that context very much frames the goals candidates should have been aiming at achieving. Steyer and Klobuchar, who are not in close contention in Iowa, ought to have been making extremely big moves in hopes of totally changing the dynamics of the race. Having slipped into second-tier status in the state, Warren and Buttigieg would have wanted to shift up their game significantly to drive renewed interest in their campaigns. As for Biden and Bernie, who are currently in a statistical tie in Iowa, they could win the state by just preventing radical shifts from taking place in the Iowa polling. Now, in part because this debate did not feature Andrew Yang or Tulsi Gabbard, and of course left out recent dropouts Cory Booker, Marianne Williamson, and Julian Castro, there's a reasonable argument to be made that this was one of the more boring debates of the primary so far. That certainly worked in the favor of frontrunners Bernie and Biden. But the night was not without its game-changing moments.
Joe and I listened to what Dick Cheney and George Bush and Rumsfeld had to say. I thought they were lying. Joe saw it differently.
Is it possible that black voters have gotten to know you and have simply decided to choose another candidate?
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
What?
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
Look, I played team sports my entire life.
In this video, I'll break down the winners and losers of the January debate. My framing will have a specific focus on who's increased or decreased their chances of winning the Iowa caucus. So let's talk about it. Who won? Let's kick things off with a big shout out to the patrons: Sergio Guerrero, Emil Stierbeck-Moller, Victor Holmberg, Torch Camaro, Thomas Lamser, C-Mac, Adam Riordan, Charlotte Holden, David Goodrich, Louise, Ryan Judge, Jack Stokes, Question Time Fan Act 2020, Denkuro, Sir Bobbit, Matthew Garish, Ahigeo Comics, Blake Mallon, Christopher Green, Sarah Parker Schmilt, Maxwell Verkuyen, Kyle Strong, Darian Kennedy, Mike Lodato, Sam Robinson, Matthias Drager, Darren Fry, Clayton Gibson, and Jeremy. A big thanks also goes out to new supporters who just joined up at patreon.com/questiontime: Leonardo Rivas, Thomas Bahoziewicz, Rob Bray, Lord Lowe, Dylan Finch, Askell Sabo, MJ the Moose of Hornwood, Jordan Wilson, Toolshed, and Niobe. Also, a big thanks to everyone who dropped donations through Super Chat during my recent live stream. Rob Bray, you were there. Special thanks to John Lang. If you were there, you know why. Okay, let's get into it. Let's begin with Elizabeth Warren.
The government lets contracts for all kinds of things. Let's let the contracts out, put the contracts out, so that we can put more generic drugs out there and drive down those prices. This is a way to make markets work.
The Iowa debate marks the first time we could see clear daylight emerge between Warren and her longtime friend Bernie Sanders. The onstage tension, of course, stemmed from a feud that emerged throughout the weekend leading up to the 7th Democratic debate. Two separate but related issues gave rise to the spat. The first, which was not raised during the debate, was over an alleged Sanders campaign memo of dubious origin, which gave talking points about the electability of various primary competitors. The document claimed that Warren was unlikely to excite voters who do not already consistently vote for the Democratic Party. Warren responded to the story saying that she was disappointed that Sanders was sending volunteers out to trash her campaign. Soon after, a new issue emerged, a story confirmed by Warren and probably stemming exclusively from sources inside her campaign, alleged that Sanders had told her in a private one-on-one meeting that he didn't think a woman would be electable. This issue was raised by moderators, and here is how Sanders responded.
Why did you say that?
Well, as a matter of fact, I didn't say it. And I don't want to waste a whole lot of time on this because this is what Donald Trump and maybe some of the media want. Anybody knows me knows that it's incomprehensible that I would think that a woman could not be president of the United States. Go to YouTube today. There's a video of me 30 years ago talking about how a woman could become president of the United States. In 2015, I deferred, in fact, to Senator Warren. There was a movement to draft Senator Warren to run for president. And you know what? I stayed back. Senator Warren decided not to run, and I did run afterwards. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes. How could anybody in a million years not believe that a woman could become president of the United States. And let me be very clear. If any of the women on this stage or any of the men on this stage win the nomination, I hope that's not the case. I hope it's me. But if they do, I will do everything in my power to make sure that they are elected in order to defeat the most dangerous president in the history of our country.
Moderators then turned to Warren to respond, and here's what she had to say.
I disagreed. Bernie is my friend, and I am not here to try to fight with Bernie. But look, this question about whether or not a woman can be president has been raised, and it's time for us to attack it head on. And I think the best way to talk about who can win is by looking at people's winning record. So, can a woman beat Donald Trump? Look at the men on this stage. Collectively, they have lost 10 elections. The only people on this stage who have won every single election that they've been in are the women, Amy and me. And the only person on this stage who has beaten an incumbent Republican any time in the past 30 years is me.
While on stage, she de-escalated the fight, wisely moving on from personal beef to a more serious issue, the actual electability of women. On that topic, at least publicly, Sanders and Warren agree.
Does anybody in their right mind think that a woman cannot be elected president? Nobody believes that. If Hillary Clinton got 3 million votes, more votes than Trump.
But after the debate, the fight over this issue clearly continued, with Warren refusing to shake Bernie's hand and Sanders abruptly walking away from what looked like a heated conversation. More recently, audio leaked from that tense moment, so let's take a look at that.
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
What?
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
Let's not do it right now. You want to have that discussion? We'll have that
Anytime.
discussion. You called me. You told me. All right, let's not do it now.
I don't want to get in the middle of it. I just want to say hi, Bernie.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Well, my initial reading of Warren's refusal to shake Bernie's hand was that this would lose her support, as it made her look petty and uncivil. The fact that she is distancing herself from Sanders may actually be to her political benefit, at least in the short term. While you should definitely take this with a grain of salt, a 538 Ipsos study of the debate showed that Warren's debate performance was evaluated to be unexpectedly high, given her pre-debate favorability. This means she likely gained new ground, at least when it comes to the voters this study interviewed before and after the January debate. Winners and losers opinion pieces by the New York Times, Business Insider, CNN, USA Today, Washington Post, and Vox all identified Warren as a winner or win adjacent without any way claiming she lost. Much of her claimed victory may be from observers glossing over or ignoring the fact that she refused that handshake. I think there's something else at play. Warren in this debate distanced herself from Sanders, thus positioning herself to scoop up the former supporters of recent dropouts like Julian Castro and Cory Booker, who, while reasonably liberal, lie further to the right on the political spectrum, as do Warren and Bernie Sanders. Distancing herself from Bernie was not just personal. Policy differences were also highlighted. For example, Warren pointing out that she differed with Bernie on the USMCA.
Senator Warren, you support the USMCA. Why is Senator Sanders wrong?
I do. I wasn't here. I haven't been in Congress long enough to have voted against NAFTA, but I led the fight. But we have farmers here in Iowa who are hurting, and they are hurting because of Donald Trump's initiated trade wars. We have workers who are hurting because the agreements that have already been cut really don't have enforcement on workers' rights. This new trade deal is a modest improvement. Senator Sanders himself has said so. It will give some relief to our farmers. It will give some relief to our workers. I believe we accept that relief. We try to help the people who need help, and we get up the next day and fight for a better trade deal.
While attempting to broaden her appeal with more moderate voters may have alienated the left, there's good reason to suspect this was a beneficial move for her campaign. Recall that Warren began slipping in the polls in October of 2019. Around that time, she unveiled a progressive environmental justice plan and declared it's time to break up Amazon, Google, and Facebook. In mid-November, she experienced another strong dip, which dropped her into third place. This happened just after she firmed up her pro-Medicare for all stance, releasing her own plan that was widely praised by progressive commentators. It seems then that the more closely Warren aligned herself to the stances of the most progressive candidate in the race, the more she seemed to lose ground to him. After all, why would far-left progressives support Warren when Sanders already has more deeply rooted ties to the progressive movement? By distancing herself from Sanders, both personally and on policy, Warren is perhaps reframing her position from just as progressive as Sanders to progressive but not Bernie Sanders. While the gambit might lose her some support from the far left, she may have more opportunity to grow by edging slightly rightward. It's clear that trying to be the most progressive candidate in the race was not working for her, so staking out this new space is perhaps her best chance of gaining ground. I think her issues with Bernie are in fact genuine, driven by real beliefs and even real feelings. But even if that spat was not a clever scheme, the effect appears to be to her advantage. At least potentially, and only in the short run. The goal of this debate for Warren ought to have been to increase her chances of winning in Iowa. And I think Warren did that. So in that sense, it was a win for her campaign.
We need to fundamentally change priorities in America. We should not be one of the few countries that does not have universal, high-quality, affordable childcare. We should not be one of the only major countries not to guarantee health care to all people as a human right. We should not be spending more than the 10 next countries on the military, hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, tax breaks for billionaires, and then tell the moms and dads in this country we cannot have high-quality, affordable childcare. That is wrong.
While conflicts between candidates tend to make one or both look worse, Warren distancing herself from Sanders may actually be to their mutual advantage. With Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard out of the debates, at least for now, Elizabeth Warren was the only candidate on stage who was competitive for the progressive mantle. If she is shifting to the middle, this will only help him to consolidate the progressive base. When it comes to the actual conflict over the he said, she said, neither candidate came out of the uneasy conflict looking particularly muddied. Warren didn't press the matter and moved on to an area of agreement. Sanders firmly declared that he did not say what her campaign had alleged and cited significant evidence of his belief that a woman could win the presidency, his deferment to Warren in 2015, and his encouragement of female candidates to run as far back as 30 years ago. Sanders also accurately corrected Warren over an extremely insignificant issue.
Well, just to set the record straight, I defeated an incumbent Republican running for Congress.
When?
1990. That's how I won, beat a Republican congressman. Number two, of course, I don't think there's any debate up here.
Wasn't it 30 years ago?
I beat an incumbent Republican congressman.
And I said I was the only one who's beaten an incumbent Republican in 30 years.
Well, 30 years ago was 1990, as a matter of fact. But I don't know that that's the major issue of the day.
It's clear he's correct here. 1990 was within the last 30 years, which proves her previous statement to be false. Small issue, but it builds up his credibility, and he made the correction with a nice, gentle approach. Further aiding Sanders in securing the support of the populist left was the hostility demonstrated by moderators towards the senator. They brazenly took Warren's side on the he said, she said.
Senator Sanders, I do want to be clear here. You're saying that you never told Senator Warren that a woman could not win the election.
That is correct.
Senator Warren, what did you think when Senator Sanders told you a woman could not win the election?
There's of course no good reason to assume that she's right and he's wrong on this. It's possible it was a misunderstanding. It's possible they both remember it differently. At the same time, there's a cynical reason why Warren's campaign could have made this up to play into the sexism narrative that Clinton affiliates smeared Sanders with in 2015 and 2016. A lot of people have questioned Warren's account, including Michael Moore, who knows both Warren and Sanders personally, and claims it's inconceivable that Sanders would say that. Even Donald Trump, who knows he's more likely to face Sanders than Warren in the general election, and therefore has every reason to side with Warren, admitted that he doesn't believe Sanders said it. At any rate, here's another hostile question for Sanders.
Senator Sanders, you've consistently refused to say exactly how much your Medicare for All plan is going to cost. Don't voters deserve to see the price tag before you send them a bill that could cost tens of trillions of dollars?
As I pointed out in my last debate breakdown, no one knows what the cost will be because it's an extremely large change. So he's not refusing to say how much it will cost, It's actually the CBO's job to estimate costs. Also, he's very likely not increasing the overall costs paid out by taxpayers, just whether those costs go to corporations or the government. And on the matter of paying for things, this debate had an extended conversation about foreign policy, and no one bothered to ask about the costs of international conflicts, which Sanders voted against. But because Sanders wants to give people health care, he got multiple questions like this.
How would you keep your plans from bankrupting the country?
The hostility from the moderators continued in a moment that seemed very similar to a moment from December, when Sanders clashed with a moderator after he began connecting an issue about race to climate change.
But Senator Sanders, to be clear, the AFL-CIO supports this deal. Are you unwilling to compromise?
The AFL-CIO does, the Machinists Union does not, and every environmental organization in this country, including the Sunrise Organization, who are supporting my candidacy, opposes it. If we do not get our act together in terms of climate change, the planet that we're going to be leaving our kids and our children and our grandchildren will be increasingly unlivable and uninhabitable.
We're going to get to climate change, but I'd like to stay on trade. Senator Warren.
Well, they are the same in this issue.
It was strong of Sanders to punctuate the connection there. Sanders did a lot of work to attach himself to the issue of the environment in this debate.
If we as a nation do not transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, not by 2050, not by 2040, but unless we lead the world right now, not easy stuff, the planet we are leaving our kids will be uninhabitable and unhealthy. We are seeing Australia burning. We saw California burning. The drought here in Iowa is going to make it harder for farmers to produce the food that we need. This is, of course, a national crisis. I've introduced legislation to indicate it's a national crisis. We have got to take on the fossil fuel industry and all of their lies and tell them that their short-term profits are not more important than the future of this planet. That's what the Green New Deal does. That's what my legislation does, and that is what we have to do.
The fact that Sanders continued to dominate the conversation about the environment was also a particularly wise choice for him. Sanders is already probably the biggest name associated with healthcare, the top issue for Democratic voters. Recurrently returning to climate change allows him to dominate another big issue. According to a recent Pew study, climate change is the second biggest issue for Democratic voters and the top issue for liberal Democratic voters. Sanders also gained points extremely early on in the debate, contrasting his Iraq vote to that of Joe Biden.
In 2002, when the Congress was debating whether or not we go into a war in Iraq, invade Iraq, I got up on the floor of the House and I said that would be a disaster. It would lead to unprecedented levels of chaos in the region. And I not only voted against the war, I helped lead the effort against that war.
I said 13 years ago it was a mistake to give the president the authority to go to war if, in fact, he couldn't get inspectors into Iraq to stop what thought to be the attempt to get a nuclear weapon. It was a mistake, and I acknowledge that. But right out, the man who also argued against that war, Barack Obama.
The moderators followed up, drawing a false equivalence to Sanders' vote on Afghanistan.
Senator Sanders, you have been attacking Vice President Biden's vote on the Iraq war, but you recently acknowledged that your vote to authorize the war in Afghanistan was also a mistake. So you've both acknowledged mistakes. Why should the American people trust your judgment more?
Sanders countered effectively, explaining clearly why Afghanistan was not Iraq.
Well, there's a little bit of a difference on that particular vote. Every single member of the House, including myself, voted for it. Only Barbara Lee voted against it. The difference here is that the war in Iraq turned out to be the worst foreign policy blunder in the modern history of this country. As Joe well knows, we lost 4,500 brave troops. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. We have spent trillions of dollars on that endless war, money which should go into healthcare and education and infrastructure in this country.
So all in all, a strong showing for Sanders. He appeared to be a winner of this debate. Just as the early conflict over Iraq votes was clearly a win for Sanders, the fact that this topic was broached so early was a problem for Joe Biden.
But right out, the man who also argued against that war, Barack Obama, picked me to be his vice president. And once we were elected president, and vice president, he turned to me and asked me to end that war. I know what it's like to send a son or daughter, like our colleague has gone to war in Afghanistan, my son for a year in Iraq. And that's why I do it very, very reluctantly. That's why I led the effort, as you know, Wolf, against surging tens of thousands of troops into Afghanistan.
Biden did a decent job of defending himself, explaining how he had changed his mind on his Iraq vote a long time ago and was a part of ending that conflict, but the basic facts of the matter are not in his favor. He made a mistake on the issue while Sanders did not. Regardless of his reasonable response, he probably lost some points here, but the damage was likely not game-changing. The difference in their votes here have been pointed out in numerous previous debates. Speaking of repeats, Biden and Sanders clashed again over healthcare. While both brought out the same old talking points, there seemed to be a clear winner when it comes to charisma and energy.
I think we need to be candid with voters. I think we have to tell them what we're going to do and what it's going to cost. And a 4% tax on income over $24,000 doesn't even come close to paying for between 30 and some estimates as high as $40 trillion over 10 years. That's doubling the entire federal budget per year. There's a way to do that. The way to do that is to take Obamacare, reinstate, rebuild it, provide a public option, allow Medicare for those folks who want it, and in fact, make sure that we, in the process, reduce the cost of drug prices, reduce the cost of being able to buy into the subsidize it further, and make it available to everyone. Here's the deal. That costs a lot of money. That costs $740 billion over 10 years. I lay out how I pay for that.
Senator Sanders?
Well, first of all, what Joe forgets to say is when you leave the current system as it is, what you are talking about are workers paying, on average, 20% of their incomes for health care. That is insane. You got 500,000 people going bankrupt because they cannot pay their medical bills. We're spending twice as much per capita on health care as do the people of any other country. Look, we've talked about health care for all in this country for over 100 years. Now is the time to take on the greed and corruption of the healthcare industry, of the drug companies, and finally provide health care to all through a Medicare for all single-payer program. It won't be easy, but that is what we have to do.
You can do it without that. You can do it without Medicare for all. You can get the same place.
Biden here seemed less passionate, less concerned, and less forceful than did Sanders. Biden's performance overall in this debate was not all that different from what he typically has done throughout the primary race. He frequently stumbled over his words, seemed evasive on some questions, and seemed to lose track of what he was saying. His performance was probably worse than some of his better debates, but he managed to avoid making serious gaffes, and in context, that's probably enough to make this debate a default win for the former VP. Unlike the other candidates, Biden could actually lose Iowa and New Hampshire and still be in strong contention for the nomination, as he leads by more than 5 points in Nevada and by a landslide in South Carolina. Even if Biden only wins 2 out of these 4 states, he could easily hang on to enough of a nationwide lead to win the nomination. So winning in Iowa would really just be gravy for his campaign. Yet Biden has seen his poll numbers raise significantly in recent weeks. He is currently in a statistical tie with Sanders for first in Iowa. He's also in a close second in New Hampshire, again pretty much a tie with Bernie Sanders. While Biden did not have one of his best performances in this debate, it wasn't bad enough to cause his poll numbers to plummet. He probably remains in strong contention for Iowa, a state he doesn't even need to win. So in that context, this debate was good enough to be counted as a win for the former vice president.
My own dad, I know when his long-term care insurance ends. And then we have some savings for him. He's in assisted living. He got married 3 times, whole nother story, so there isn't much there.
Amy Klobuchar was a clear loser in this debate, and here's a clip that pretty much sums up her performance.
Yeah, Senator Sanders and I have worked together on pharmaceuticals for a long, long time, and we agree on this. But what I don't agree with is that his position on healthcare. This debate isn't real. I was in Vegas the other day and someone said, don't put your chips on a number on the wheel that isn't even on the wheel. That's the problem.
Forget the fact that her metaphor was extremely weak. Her delivery alone was enough to count this as a loss. After stronger than usual performances in November and December, Klobuchar seems to have moved backwards. She was shaky, stumbled often, and brought back some rather weak and irrelevant talking points.
I point out that you don't have to be the tallest person in the room. James Madison was 5'4". You don't have to be the skinniest person in the room. You don't have to be the loudest person. You have to be competent.
Not to mention, she decided to name drop Laura Kelly while forgetting her name.
And when you look at the facts, Michigan has a woman governor right now, and she beat a Republican, Gretchen Whitmer. Kansas has a woman governor right now, and she beat Chris Kobach. And her name is, I'm very proud to know her, and her name is Governor Kelly. Thank you.
The only upside to Klobuchar's performance is that far, far behind the top 4 in Iowa, she really had no chance to win this state anyway. Maybe she's saving up the good stuff for another contest. Probably Nevada, because she made multiple references to gambling.
This president is treating people out there like poker chips in one of his bankrupt casinos.
Unlike Klobuchar and Biden, Buttigieg did not fumble his words during the January debate. He was well rehearsed, and if anything, too smooth in his delivery.
This is our moment. This is our one shot to defeat Donald Trump, and to do it by such a big margin that we send Trumpism into the dustbin of history too.
He got what was probably his strongest moment in fairly early, during the foreign policy discussion where he talked about his personal experiences in Iraq and mentioned the foreign affairs issues of the future.
Well, I bring a different perspective. There are enlisted people that I served with barely old enough to remember those votes on the authorization after 9/11, on the war in Iraq. And there are people now old enough to enlist who were not alive for some of those debates. The next president is going to be confronted with national security challenges different in scope and in kind from anything we've seen before. Not just conventional military challenges, not just stateless terrorism, but cybersecurity challenges, climate security challenges, foreign interference in our elections. It's going to take a view to the future as well as the readiness to learn from the lessons of the past. And for me, those lessons of the past are personal.
This being his strongest moment, however, is a bit problematic for Buttigieg. Sure, he was well spoken, but he also did little to distinguish his performance from past debates. One moment that did stand out, however, was a relatively negative moment where he was asked about his support from the Black community.
Is it possible that Black voters have gotten to know you and have simply decided to choose another candidate?
Pete's answer was not great.
The Black voters who know me best are supporting me. It's why I have the most support in South Bend. It's why among elected Black officials in my community who have gotten into this race, by far most of them are supporting me. And now, nationally, I am proud that my campaign is co-chaired by a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and to have support right here in Iowa from some of the most recognizable Black elected leaders, from Mayor Hart of Waterloo to former Representative Berry in Black Hawk County.
Again, not a good answer. Endorsements from politicians are not the same thing as support from the people. Support from your own small city is not reflective of the country. In fact, if any minority group from within South Bend did not support Pete over the other candidates, that would be extremely embarrassing. While Mayor Pete was a bit of a wallflower throughout a lot of this debate, not engaging much with other candidates, perhaps the biggest sparring match he was in was with Elizabeth Warren. This began with Warren making a relatively unheard argument about why her healthcare plan is more expensive than the plans of the moderates.
We all talk about plans, healthcare plans that we have, and these plans are paid for. The problem is that plans like the mayor's and like the vice president's is that they are an improvement. They are an improvement over where we are right now. But they're a small improvement. And that's why it is that they cost so much less. Because by themselves, they're not going to be enough to cover prescriptions for 36 million people who can't afford to get them filled. What we need to do is make the commitment that we know where the money comes from. We can ask those at the very top, the top 1%, to pay a little more. Those giant corporations like Chevron and Amazon who paid nothing in taxes, we can have them pay. And we can go after the corporate tax cheats. And when we do that, we have enough money to provide health care for all our people.
And here was Pete's response.
It's just not true that the plan I'm proposing is small. We got to move past a Washington mentality that suggests that the bigness of plans only consists of how many trillions of dollars they put through the Treasury. that the boldness of a plan only consists of how many Americans it can alienate. This would be a game changer. This would be the biggest thing we've done to American healthcare in a half century.
You'll notice he's made this same argument in the exact same way in previous debates. Bigness and boldness, Washington mentality, same old, same old. While he was surging in the polls, a lukewarm repeat performance like this might have been good enough to secure a win for the mayor. But his numbers have been slipping since the end of November. Once the front-runner in Iowa, Buttigieg is now a couple points behind Biden and Sanders, given that he ought to be attempting to change up his strategy, but he did nothing new. So if the polling has been accurate, this may very well spell the beginning of the end of Pete's campaign, as a victory in Iowa was really his best chance to stake out an early victory that could lead to a broader surge nationwide. Having failed to make waves, Pete's January debate performance appears to be a loss.
Standing up for what's right is always worth it, Wolf. And I will never back down from that.
And then there's Tom Steyer, who also repeated himself quite frequently in this debate.
Look, we've had this conversation on this stage so many times.
He rehashed the point that he was the only person on stage who would make climate change his number one priority.
I'm the only person on this stage who says climate's my number one priority.
And he even made the same weak jab at Buttigieg about climate change not being an important enough priority for the mayor.
I cannot allow this country to go down the path of climate destruction. Everybody in their generation knows it. Frankly, Mayor Buttigieg, you're their generation. I think you would be standing up more. That's why I'm standing up for it. We cannot put climate on the back seat all the time.
Steyer's performance was as predictable as his choice of tie, and he was as irrelevant to this debate as this out-of-context clip from his closing statement.
Look, I played team sports my entire life. The bond between teammates is deep and emotional and full of love. And if there's one thing I will not permit, it is someone to run down the field and kick my teammate in the face.
Steyer has proven once again that he is utterly out of his depth in these debates. He seems to continuously run down the field and kick himself in the face. And as his teammate, I don't want to permit this, and humbly recommend that he quit while he's behind and forget about his pointless and futile campaign. His money would be much better spent supporting a plausible candidate in the general election. At the end of the day, the 7th Democratic debate appeared to be as inconsequential as it was boring. The three frontrunners, Warren, Sanders, and Biden, seemed to eke out narrow victories, while the three lower polling candidates appeared to fall a little further behind. The most significant change to come out of this debate appears to be the new rift forming between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Should that beef continue to grow, while it may be to the short-term political benefit of both candidates, it could cause lasting damage to their personal friendship, and far more importantly, the progressive movement. But perhaps even more significant to the primary race was what didn't happen. And that's a scramble amongst all the candidates to go after Joe Biden. Like I said earlier, Biden could win the nomination even if he loses in Iowa. The same case could not be made for any other candidate on stage except perhaps Bernie Sanders. Unless the other candidates levy serious attacks to take on the frontrunner of this race, Joe Biden will almost doubtlessly become the answer to the biggest question history will ask about the 2020 Democratic primary. Who won? Certainly not the answer to that question are Julian Castro, Marianne Williamson, and Cory Booker, our most recent batch of dropouts from the Democratic primary contest for the 2020 election. So I leave you with a short tribute to some of the great moments of their campaigns and their graciousness in ending them.
Good evening y bienvenidos a Texas. Welcome to Texas. In many ways, I shouldn't be here on this stage, you know.
You're dipping into the Kool-Aid and you don't even know the flavor.
It's really nice if we got all these plans, but if you think we're going to beat Donald Trump by just having all these plans, you got another thing coming.
I had tires on my car slashed, our campaign offices were broken into, my phones were tapped.
Yeah, that's called a Democratic primary election. That's called an election.
We are never going to solve this crisis if we have to wait for it to personally affect us or our neighborhood or our community before we demand action.
It looks like one of us has learned the lessons of the past and one of us hasn't.
And I've heard some people here tonight, I almost wonder why you're Democrats. You seem to think there's something wrong about using the instruments of government meant to help people.
If you want to compare records, and frankly, I'm shocked that you do.
What we need are politicians that actually have some guts on this issue.
Thank you, Secretary.
Payment of a debt that is owed. That is what reparations is.
We have a criminal justice system that Brian Stevenson says treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent.
They do not have to buy in.
You just said that. You just said that 2 minutes ago. You just said 2 minutes ago that they would have to buy in.
Because I have seen what the carnage creates in communities like mine.
Are you forgetting what you said 2 minutes ago?
I lived in Grosse Pointe. What happened in Flint would not have happened in Grosse Pointe.
Are you forgetting already what you said just 2 minutes ago?
Mr. Vice President, you can't have it both ways. You invoke President Obama more than anybody in this campaign. You can't do it when it's convenient and then dodge it when it's not.
I mean, I can't believe that you said 2 minutes ago that they had to buy in, and now you're saying they don't have to buy. You're forgetting that.
So, Mr. President, if you're listening, I want you to hear me, please.
I'm fulfilling the legacy of Barack Obama, and you're not.
I'm going to harness love for political purposes. I will meet you on that field, and sir, love will win.
Run down the field and kick my teammate in the face.